Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Land Warfare Conference. And we said welcome to lots of people yesterday. I would particularly like to welcome the NCO community. Great to see so many of you here. It's always a great reminder to know that thinking is not just an officer's sport and that actually you've got a huge amount to contribute. So please do get on Slido, stand up and speak, and we need to hear your voice as well. I was reflecting last night, as many of you I'm sure were doing, on day 1, having started with CGS's call for an intellectual revolution, and I think we sort of tried to take you outside your comfort zone a little bit about competing in the grey zone, whether that was from subterfuge or perhaps a policy of targeted assassination. We really tried to broaden and open up the possibilities. And you responded. You are a brilliant audience, which is the lovely thing we get from the Land Warfare Conference. And we have some great individuals here who ask great questions. And I was struck by Professor John France's questions yesterday, which I thought were particularly prescient. And those of you who haven't read it, John has written this amazing book called Perilous Glory, which is really the story of asymmetry and great power competition since ancient times. It's a phenomenal read which debunks a lot of the myths about searching for the next best silver bullet, about the beautiful equipment that industry will provide that will destroy the enemy with a big red button. And it's wonderful to have that perspective and end the day yesterday with the Secretary of State focusing on people. And she used D-Day as part of that metaphor for doing it, which was, to me, brilliant. But I was slightly surprised, and even as a Matlow in a previous life, slightly disappointed that all of this, including the BBC this morning and Sky News and all the others, in that the Navy had seemed to hijack D-Day, which struck me as slightly strange. Because, of course, the reality is that the Navy didn't do D-Day. D-Day was required because naval and air forces are not decisive. In military actions, it takes a land force to take and hold ground. You can try and do it virtually from over the horizon, but virtual presence is actual absence. And today we see that being around Europe and in the Asia Pacific as being something that is felt keenly by our allies. But it's also slightly a misnomer to think perhaps that this was a purely British effort. And I think if you looked at some of the reporting, you could feel it was just slightly a British effort, perhaps with some of our close partners. And actually, D-Day and the offensives in 44 started in 43. And it was about a multinational coalition of the willing. It was about the Russian front. It was about the Chinese fight in Japan or against Japan. These were huge multinational coalitions that came together to defeat a single adversary, a pair of adversaries with a unity of purpose. And Sergei Lavrov made a speech yesterday which made this point quite clearly, is that we shouldn't skew history in many ways to suit our own current narrative, that we should acknowledge the huge part played by our allies. But the key is that we also seem to forget there was a Pacific War as well. And the Pacific War was distinctly different from the European theatre. And in this, it reminds us sometimes that a unified theory of fighting simply doesn't cut it. And in many ways, as we went through multi-domain operations, we went through and hinted at integrated action, we talked about strike. A single unified theory of war just doesn't work in differentiated conflicts. And today, I think we might see a little more of that coming out as we turn to the themes of today, which is definitely multinational. It is about disruption, and it's about the lessons from history. Now, we're supposed to start off with someone who might have put this in perspective. General Zabrodsky has been called in by his president, his new president in Ukraine, and so can't be here this morning. But if he was here, he'd probably tell you the story of the Ukrainian armed forces between 2007 and 2014, where they adopted a grand force design that was given to them by the West, the Americans, the Brits, and others, which transformed a large conscript force into a small, beautiful, boutique, all-volunteer, kick-ass force. Or so they thought. And in 2014, they got rolled over in 24 hours. Had it not been for a crowd-funded 40,000-person militia who were provided with software-defined radios off Amazon, body armor second-hand from eBay, and quite a lot of informational tools provided by the web, then the Russians may have got much further than they did. And Zabrodsky is quite passionate about this. He says that he was provided with false advice, that the West, and they did, paid millions of pounds and dollars to destroy millions of tons of stockpiled ammunition that the Ukrainians could have really used. In this, in many ways, the Western force design that they gave to the Ukrainians, and indeed they gave to the Georgians, met with no success because it had presumptions about what conflict would look like. We gave them an idea that was based on our own presumptions because we didn't take into account that the enemy gets a vote. And the enemy does get a vote. And in conflict, the enemy's part is absolutely crucial. Now, as Ewan Lawson pointed out yesterday, the paper Future Operating Concept, the Future Conflict Operating Environment that RUSI's just produced and released on Monday is an enemy-centric view of the future. It looks at brinkmanship and it looks at proxy warfare. It looks at economic coercion. It looks at thresholds. And it tries to overlay that on some of the force designs going forward. And one of the problems that comes out of that is how do you address some of those core problems of the enemy and the adversary? How do you deal with them? Because today, unlike 75 years ago, we do not have scale to fall back on in national terms. What we do have is NATO. We have scale in a very different way that emerged from the crucible of the Second World War. Who else could talk to us about NATO but Ambassador Sarah Macintosh, CMG, who is the UK's permanent representative to NATO and has been since February 17. Sarah is a long-term friend of RUSI and has agreed to step up this morning and provide us with the opening keynote. Previously, Sarah was Director General of Defence Intelligence at the FCO. Before that, she was Director of Strategy and Finance. Before that, she was previously High Commissioner in Sierra Leone. She's been the Ambassador in Liberia, Strategic Coordinator in the UN mission. She is a career professional diplomat. But Sarah, unlike many diplomats, doesn't do the fluff and the wool. Sarah is a powerhouse in NATO where alongside the US Perm Rep, Kay Bailey-Hutchison, they form a formidable pair of influencers. She tends to avoid the bombastic, the populist views, and what she brings is clarity, is perspective, and is grit. Sarah is going to make some remarks. We'll have a bit of time for Q&A before we go to the rest. So please join me, please, in welcoming Sarah.
Good morning. This week we commemorate the courage and sacrifice of those who gave their lives for our liberty 75 years ago. For generations, at the heart of our transatlantic alliance has been our shared democratic values, our common interests, and our commitment to justice. That unity of purpose will preserve the deep-rooted ties between our peoples, underpin our nation's security and prosperity for the next 75 years and beyond, as it did 75 years ago. from my service to all of yours. Thank you for your service. In 1948, the Foreign Office advised Ernest Bevin in a secret memo, now declassified, if peace is to be preserved, the free nations must get together, otherwise they risk being picked off one by one. A year later, Prime Minister Attlee said of the Washington Treaty establishing NATO, "We seek by the organization of security to make the world safe from aggression." President Truman, "We hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression, a bulwark that will permit us to get on with the real business of government and society, that is a fuller and happier life for all our citizens." And Dwight Eisenhower, NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander, "We are concerned not only with the protection of territory, but with the defense of a way of life." NATO's founders drew ambition for the alliance wide, not just defense against large-scale war, not just defense against the Soviet Union, not just military defense, but to make the world safer and to defend our way of life. NATO is the most successful alliance in history because for 70 years it has adapted and evolved to do that. Because NATO has been the backdrop to all of our lives, we know that. But sometimes we take it for granted. So in this anniversary year, it bears remembering what the ages of NATO have done for us. From 1949, NATO helped to heal the wounds of the Second War and bring together Europe and the Euro-Atlantic. From 12 founding members being joined by Greece and Turkey together in 1952, West Germany in 55, Spain in 82, and now to 29 allies. Through the decades of the Cold War, NATO's strength, stability, and deterrence helped to maintain peace and ultimately to lift the Iron Curtain. As then Prime Minister Thatcher said, "Our friends from Eastern Europe say that their victory came about because for 40 long, cold years, the West stood firm against the military threat from the East." As the Warsaw Pact ended, Lech Walesa came to NATO seeking partnership, and Helmut Kohl came to consult on Germany's reunification. NATO started to support the Europe whole and free, agreed in the final act at Helsinki. The open door policy supported new states and those formerly under Soviet influence or control to grow their freedom, import values, standards and security, and create for themselves a Euro-Atlantic perspective. Through the 90s, as Russia seemed to turn towards partnership, NATO maintained deterrence but also focused on broader threats, countering terrorist threat in Afghanistan, making and keeping peace in the Balkans, and countering piracy. And in 2014, when the security situation changed again with Russia's invasion and occupation of Crimea and the emergence of Daesh in Syria, the alliance adapted again, deploying new battle groups in the Baltics and Poland, increasing air policing across Europe, tripling the size of the NATO response force, creating a spearhead force, increasing alliance readiness, agreeing new strategies for air power, maritime posture, countering hybrid attacks, cyber and defense of vulnerable allies, and a new military strategy, modernizing the command structure, creating 2 new headquarters, and putting in place 24/7 missile defense against threat from the Middle East. Taken together, this is the biggest reinforcement of collective defense in a generation. And at the same time, we have increased NATO's contribution to the global fight against terrorism, joined the global coalition, building defense capacity in Afghanistan, Jordan, Tunisia, increasing support to Georgia and Ukraine, and NATO's presence in the Black Sea. We've launched a new mission in Iraq, established a hub for the South, admitted a 29th ally, Montenegro, and signed the accession protocol for a 30th, North Macedonia. And we've agreed new partnerships, including NATO's first partner in Latin America. And all allies have increased investment in defense. It's quite a lot of adaptation for 5 years. And through the 70 years and the successive ages of NATO, the alliance has helped to support Western unity through politics and sometimes disagreement, to save money. Collective defense is always cheaper than individual, and deterrence is cheaper than defending against attack. It's helped to adapt our capabilities and plan for the future. It's helped us to work together with common standards, doctrine and command structure, and with institutional partnerships, especially with the European Union, and it has kept us safe. NATO's deterrence continues every day. As NATO has evolved and adapted, so has the UK, including our leading role in the alliance, from the British Army of the Rhine and Poseidon nuclear weapons to I4, S4 and K4 in the Balkans and to ISAF in Afghanistan. Today, we are leading NATO's Forward Presence Battle Group in Estonia and supporting the one in Poland, contributing ships to the NATO Baltic and Black Sea missions and planes to air policing, leading NATO's response force through the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force. We're housing NATO's mission in Iraq and contributing to missions in the Balkans. We're leading NATO's security force in Kabul and the Afghan Officer Academy. We're hosting NATO's Maritime Command and Intelligence Fusion Centre. We were the first ally to offer to NATO our offensive cyber capabilities, and now our National Cybersecurity Centre's world-leading cybersecurity expertise. We're promoting and contributing to NATO's developing work to counter hybrid threats, and we continue to meet our 2% and 20% defence investment commitments, and to commit our continuous at-sea deterrence to the defence of NATO. The Secretary-General's just written to the Prime Minister thanking UK for 50 years of CASD at NATO's service. All that we do today. And tomorrow we will take our share of the commitments to come, including developing new capabilities through the Modernising Defence Programme and assigning them to NATO. But the world continues to harden and darken, and NATO allies have more to do. I point to three things perhaps in particular. First, we need to stay strong in facing current challenges of Russia and terrorism. The relationship we have today with Russia is not the one that any ally wants. So NATO pursues a dual-track policy of deterrence and defence on one hand and dialogue at the same time, making clear that we have no quarrel with the Russian people and that we are open to a different relationship if Russia changes her approach. But for now, a pattern of Russian aggression, malign activity and abuse of the international rules-based system continue, so we must continue to adapt our deterrence and defence. This year, that includes responding to Russian violations of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and deployment of new treaty-violating missiles. There is time for Russia to return to compliance with the INF Treaty before the 2nd of August, and we urge her to do that. At the same time, we will continue to develop NATO's contribution to the fight against terrorism, to support our partners and neighbours with their own security, including through our missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and to develop NATO's defence capacity building to go further and wider. Because when our neighbours are more secure, we are more secure. Second challenge, we continue to adapt to the changing nature of conflict. I think of this as being high-tech and hybrid. On the high-tech side, NATO has adapted rapidly to a cyber age, strengthening our defences, working with industry, and taking a series of important decisions that cyber attacks can reach the level of force, and Article 5 applies, that cyberspace is a domain of operations for NATO, and that we will defend ourselves as effectively in cyberspace as we do on land, at sea, and in the air, and that NATO may use allies' nationally owned cyber effects or offensive cyber capabilities. But we can and should do more to improve our ability to deter cyber attacks, and the Foreign Secretary has made this a priority for the UK. We'll also be considering the implications of two further phases of technology change. The novel weapons threatened by President Putin in his speech of March last year, like nuclear-powered cruise and hypersonic glide, and disruptive technologies that change our frame of reference, like artificial intelligence, automation, machine learning, quantum computing. They have the potential to change conflict and contest as significantly as flight did 100 years ago. So we'll be working together to understand the risks and threats, seeking out the opportunities and innovating, and responding to the implications for security, for deterrence, and for arms control. NATO has also adapted to increasing use of hybrid tactics against allies by improving our indicators and warnings, strengthening resilience, countering disinformation, better strategic communications, working closely with the EU. But there is more that can be done. And alongside both those, the third challenge of continuing to improve our burden sharing. Here too, there's good progress and further to go. All allies have agreed to meet their capability targets. All allies are contributing to operations. All allies are increasing their defence investment. In 2014, all allies agreed to invest more in defence. In 2015, they arrested the decline in defence investment. Between 2016 and 2018, non-US allies invested $41 billion more in defence, and by 2020, that figure will be $100 billion more. There's further to go for all allies to meet their commitment to invest 2%, but $100 billion is a lot of money in any world. The next panel will, I think, look further ahead and talk about the changing global landscape in which NATO will operate for the next 70 years. So I'll just say 3 brief things on that. We're moving from an industrial age to an information age. That will change both the nature of contest between states for ideas, values, and hearts, and the economics of conflict, from miniaturization and swarming to battlefield resupply to the possibility of the private ownership of the means of waging war. The implications are profound and need to be understood well. Second, the Foreign Secretary recalls his predecessor, George Canning, describing the global balance of power as a standard perpetually varying, with new nations rising and the global order changing. That is happening again, and the implications should be understood. And third, our long-term security will also be influenced by much wider factors, like access to technology, global network development, interconnectivity and global supply chains, asymmetric demographic change, increased urbanization, and environmental change. NATO will not lead the international response to many of those challenges, but underwriting allies' security does mean understanding all the challenges to it, contributing to the international response at the right time and in the right way, and maintaining and developing the partnerships with other leading organizations, including the European Union. That already happens. You will see more of it in future, because NATO will be a central part of our strategy for managing the uncertainty to come. NATO is 70 this year, 70 years on from Attlee, Truman and Eisenhower. NATO's now 29 allies invest $1 trillion a year in underwriting the security and defence of 1 billion people. We allies, we're different as Iceland with no standing army, Turkey on the front line of some of the toughest challenges of today, and the US with the world's most advanced military. But today, every day, we decide together, we stand together, we act together. And 6 months today, the UK will host NATO's 2019 leaders meeting against that backdrop of good progress, hardening security environment, and global change. They will celebrate 70 years of NATO and chart a course for the alliance's future. And as we plan for that event, we remember 3 things. As Jens Stoltenberg, our Secretary General, said in Munich this year, the last 70 years of peace have been the exception in Europe, not the rule. We must never take peace for granted. Second, that NATO succeeds because the alliance evolves to face new challenges with our enduring values and with our allies. As he also says, it's good to have friends. And third, that NATO is strong at 70. We stand together, we decide together, we act together. We share responsibilities, and we are all safer for that. In NATO's 70th anniversary year, as we think about challenges overcome and challenges still to come, we could all say that more often and speak up for transatlanticism. Won't you help us?